know all there is to know about the crying game. Pickety! Hello, fellow Kozamanites, and welcome once more to the CM Kozaman YouTube channel, where we answer questions sent in by generous Patreon supporters. Today's questions are all about creativity, art, and science, and they have been sent in by V. Wheatley. I would like to thank her for her patience and her generous contribution on Patreon. And if you like the answers on this video, you can also support me on Patreon on the bespoke Q&A post seen here on the pinned comment and in the video description, and ask your questions that way. Today you will probably notice that I sound like that has-been hotel character Alastor because I have been temporarily reduced to recording on internet cafes and other outdoors places because of an important house move happening in my life. And in that process, your donations will really matter a lot. So please consider supporting me. And without further elaborations, here are questions from V. Wheatley. Number 1. How do you use creativity in your career? Well, that's an interesting question. It's like, how do you use oxygen during your day? I always had this instinct of taking things from one place or one thing and applying them to another place or thing. And I've had this thing since childhood, and the more I grow and the more I learn about those things, the better you will be at what is called lateral thinking. That is to say, taking things from one end and placing them into another end where they usually don't belong. And by applying things that way, you end up being quote-unquote creative. And in that perspective, how creative you are depends on the repository of information that you carry in your head. If you know about a lot of things, you got more things to plug and play where they don't belong. But if you don't know a lot of things, you can only have so many permutations. And likewise, if you only study things about creativity, quote unquote, you will end up a little stale because there's no particular creative thing. There are just things in the world, and the more you know about them, the more creative you will be. So that's how I use creativity. I just turn inwards to what I know, and I say, okay, this looks like that. Maybe we can do it that way, be it in drawing or in conversation or in writing. And if you want any instructions on how to use creativity, I can only recommend you read, and read. And even in today, the best way to do this is by reading books cover to cover. So always read up and grow that repository of information. Number 2, how do you think art and science interact? I always liken art and science to a couple that has been forcibly divorced by a particularly ignorant and feuding village. They are, to me, the expressions of the same thing. They are expressions of human creativity and human curiosity, which at the root are actually the same thing. Now, in the present day, both have become perverted. Art has become imprisoned in the sort of New York Museum of Modern Art's expensive art school madhouse, in which you need to write 2 essays to explain every daub of paint you make. And the entire timbre of visual expression has been tainted by this art school mentality of focusing entirely on semiotics and ignoring, even covering up excuses for a lack of talent and skill in actual craftsmanship. Now, there are a lot of very skilled contemporary artists and sculptors, so my beef is not with them, but it's the kind of thing you would see at that famous banana taped to a wall kind of art. Or go to any contemporary art fair. You would see a lot of things that are just completely devoid of purpose or even beauty. The artists don't even know what they're grasping at. And one of the reasons for this degeneration is the shoehorning of art and creativity into an investment, into a commercial commodity. You may not realize this, but art is the only form of commerce in which insider trading is legal. So, especially in the early 2000s and the 2010s, a lot of art that was produced was actually speculative asset fluffing, where certain objects were created, but they were completely devoid of beauty, form, or even meaning. They were just things for people to attach speculative amounts of money to. And of course, now in the 2020s, we kind of see that beginning to collapse, which is a good thing. I think great art will always stand out no matter what time it is made in. And the case is not too different with science, actually. If you can say that the MoMA or the Art Basel mentality has imprisoned the arts, you can also say that the Elsevier mentality has imprisoned science. A lot of research these days is not made due to curiosity or even to answer pertinent questions, but it is done in a really bureaucratic and kind of foolish and blind way to advance people's careers and raise their publication appeals factors. And it's also a well known dirty secret that a lot of contemporary science experiments are not replicable. They are just things that are published on a journal and they just remain there, and that is that. If you actually want to learn more about the problems afflicting science in the contemporary day and age, you should definitely follow Sabine Hosenfelder. That is SABINEHOSSENFELDER. Definitely go and subscribe to her channel, where she talks about a lot of nightmare scenarios, such as people inventing subatomic particles to just further their own careers and other stuff like that. Long story short, I think both art and science have been tainted by the corrupting effects of money, nepotism, and careerism. And once these are out of the way, I think the forcibly divorced fields can be reunited or at least aligned closer together in the future. One can hope. Another question from V saying, how do you think we can call attention to climate change and industrial pollution through art? I think the best way to do this is to be really good at depicting something, maybe plants or animals, and being a really proficient botanical artist or a zoological artist is a lifelong task. But history is full of examples like this. One could argue that the American people's love for the outdoors and bird watching was boosted heavily through the works of a single artist. I am talking about John James Audubon here. And if you know anything about Audubon, you would probably know he is the artist responsible for illustrating birds. Now imagine you become so good at properly and magically depicting a group of organisms in your art, and then you can draw attention to their plight, and that way kind of communicate the urgency that exists to preserve these creatures or to preserve climate. So that's my answer to that question. Another question. What's a different career you would pick instead if you had to? Now that's a tough one. I just can't imagine for the life of me. Particularly because I still have a day job career that supports my art and writing. When I'm not working for my paintings or stories or this YouTube channel, I actually work as a copywriter for advertising and PR companies. So in a way, I still have the other career. Well, if I didn't do any of this, I think I would love to be involved in filmmaking and film production in some way. So that would maybe be my plan B, my getaway plan. So there is that. And finally, a combination of two questions. one saying, how does your childhood or your inner child influence your work? Well, in that respect, I think I'm very lucky. I have always honest to the wishes, the desires, and the dreams of the childhood me. One could even argue that the T20's success that all tomorrows enjoyed is in some ways a vindication of my adolescent self. Remember, I wrote that book in the early 2000s when I was 19, even 18, going to my 20s, and 20 years later, it became a globally famous internet phenomenon and soon an actual book to be published. So I think in that respect, I have always stood true to my childhood self. One could say that as a child, we dream what we want to be, and then life gets in the way. Well, in that respect, I think I've been very lucky. All my childhood dreams have been accomplished, and then some. But I have never strayed from the path I set to myself as a child. And Vivian's final question says, how would your childhood self feel about the work you make now? I think I just answered that. I think he would be proud. I've just been very lucky. I've always had this core mission in life, which you might think silly, but it was to create wonderful things that nobody else would see and be true to myself. And in doing all this, I think at least I have accomplished that. I think any artist or creative person needs to do a little rain check with their childhood self every now and then. You should ask yourself, how would the childhood me feel about what I'm doing now? And if the answer is positive, I think you're on right track. So that is that, everybody. Here were my answers to Vivian Wheatley's questions. Thank you so much. And once again, if you want to ask similar questions, the Patreon link is in the video description. Thank you all for tolerating the horrible microphone this was recorded under. And thank you all for being part of this channel. I love you all. Goodbye.